Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSPiz. It's a Ukraine war breaking news update, sort of. It happened last night and it was too late and I was too tired to do something about it. So I thought I'd start off today with the news that Nigel Farage is spouting some absolute pro-Russian nonsense. And this is incredibly dangerous. My opinion at the moment is that the world is undergoing a sort of spread of a Russian mind virus. If ever you played any of these sort of pandemic games or seen these simulations of a pandemic, some kind of virus spreading throughout the world, going from sort of city to city, the Putin mind virus or the pro-Kremlin mind virus is spreading throughout the world. And occasionally it hits on these super spreaders like Trump, David Sachs, Marjorie Taylor Greene, maybe people like Marine Le Pen, Nigel Farage, and these are super spreaders. And they use their Elon Musk, they use their platform to spread that virus out into the minds of other people. Like I talk about the movement on the map of Russian forces and Ukrainian forces, and the map moves this way or a little bit that way, or the lines move this way and that way. It's very much like that with the information spaces that we all exist in, whereby the map of the infection of our minds moves one way, or generally just one way at the moment, as more and more people become infected with the Putin mind virus. And it's insanely dangerous because these people then vote, and they vote according to their infection. It is an absolute travesty that we heard the other day. First of all, Trump in conversation with David Sachs. David Sachs is a super spreader of the Putin mind virus. And Trump decides to sit down with him to have that conversation. And then Ukraine comes up, and as Republicans against Trump says here, in a conversation with notorious anti-Ukraine propagandist David Sachs, Trump praised Putin, blamed President Biden and NATO for Putin's war against the people of Ukraine, and said the idea of Ukraine joining NATO is very provocative, traitor. So we're now going to move across to pound shot Putin, Nigel Farage in the UK. Now, you've got to remember, so Nigel Farage is in charge of Reform UK, which is an anti-immigration party. He's a right-wing populist in the UK. Now, I know some of you might really like Nigel Farage. Be really warned. Before he took up the challenge of running in the Clacton constituency for Reform, he was turning down the opportunity of running in the UK because he was going to be in the US campaigning for Trump. So him and Trump are very close. He was going to campaign on behalf of Trump at these rallies around the US. He then decided to do a bit of an about face and actually come back to the UK and run for Reform. But his views on pretty much everything are going to be fairly identical to Trump's views, and Ukraine is no different. Now, I don't want to do just an outright character assassination of Nigel Farage. I'm not a big fan of his. It's worth looking at an article that is titled "He was a deeply unembarrassed racist, Nigel Farage, by those who have known him." Some say the Reform UK leader is kind and entertaining, but it's striking how many enemies he has made even among those close to him politically. There's a really interesting article about what teachers have said about him when they called, like, his school teachers back in whenever it was, knew him as a fascist, called him a fascist and racist then. And people who've known him throughout his life, you know, he is your populist, right-wing leader. You might like some of his policies with regard to immigration, and you might think he says what we all believe and all that kind of stuff, but he is a dangerous person with actually a really disreputable, I think, framework of political thought. And you can go and find out what he truly believes by speaking to those or getting the views of those who have worked with him and known him closely. He, of course, spearheaded the Leave campaign in 2016, whilst at the same time getting German passports for his kids. But there you go. So that Nigel Farage is on that right-wing populist side of things, but he's also been something of an appeaser of Putin over time. Now, he had an interview last night with the BBC where it all came out again, and I'm afraid, yeah, he is your pound shot Putin. So what happened last night? Okay, Nigel Farage claims Russia was provoked into the Ukraine war. So he's basically spouting pro-Russian propaganda. If you think about these super spreaders, he's just become more overtly a Russian Putin, Kremlin, mind virus super spreader. So Farage, who has long been accused of being a Putin apologist, tells BBC Moscow tells the BBC that Moscow was given the excuse by the EU and NATO Eastern expansion. And we'll look at this in a second in terms of how true that is or indeed isn't. So Nigel Farage has said the EU and NATO provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine by expanding eastwards. As a Reform UK leader, he was challenged over a series of policies and beliefs in the sometimes combative TV interview. I've told you how the great thing about Britain is we've got bipartisan support for Ukraine. How Labour and the Conservatives are singing off the same song sheet. What I didn't communicate is that actually Nigel Farage, with the populist reform on the right, very much like MAGA republicanism, is actually not singing off the same song sheet and has a pro-Putin approach to politics. The question I have is how many of his electorate there believe that as well, but he will take people with him. He will take people with him. A challenge on his beliefs over the invasion of Ukraine and his stated admiration for Vladimir Putin, Farage said he disliked the Russian president personally, but admired him as a political operator because of the extent of his control over Russia. Holy crap! Like, in other words, he admires him as being a powerful dictator. Yeah, I don't like him as a person, but I love the idea of being a powerful dictator. It's exactly this is the same mold as Trump. Like, has a lot of love for Orban, Putin, Xi Jinping, Bolsonaro, etc., etc. You know, King Jong-un, loves a strong man. Yeah, okay. If you're going to push me, I say I don't like him as a person, but my goodness, he's strong and powerful, and actually, I really do like them. On why Putin invaded Ukraine, Farage said, quote, I stood up in the European Parliament in 2014 and I said there will be a war in Ukraine. Why did I say that? It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to say, quote, they're coming for us again and to go to war. He added, we provoked this war. Of course, it's his fault. He's used what we've done as an excuse. Which is a real muddled way of saying we provoked it, but it's his fault. And he'll use what we did as an excuse. But then we provoked the war. So you're trying to have your cake and eat it. You're trying to get through this idea that, yes, of course, Putin is Putin's fault. But actually, it's our fault. Really, you think it's our fault. It's just absolutely unacceptable, especially since in 2014, Putin and Russia never said anything about NATO expansionism. That was a post hoc rationalization that came later. It was after the fact rationalization that came when the later manifestation of the war. So you had the 2014 Little Green Men invasion, which was all about Donbass, Crimea, all these other reasons, and not to do with NATO expansionism. The 2022 version of the war, where it was like, how do we justify an even greater invasion? Well, let's add on a few other reasons. It was suddenly NATO expansionism. This is a really simplistic, naive approach, and just shows where his sympathies really lie. He just loves a bit of ultranationalism and I'd say fascism that we see in Putin. So the Conservatives, Labour and Liberal Democrats, so all the other main parties, have long accused Farage of being an apologist for the Russian president. This is nothing new, but the fact that he's saying it so overtly at the time when Ukraine is in the midst of this is absolutely disgusting. James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, criticised Farage's statement, saying he was, quote, echoing Putin's vile justification of the brutal invasion of Ukraine. While the former Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, and we'll go on to Ben Wallace in a second, said the Reform leader was voicing sympathy for someone who, quote, deployed nerve agents on the streets of Britain. Remember, Putin murdered or sanctioned the murder of Litvinenko and Sergei Skripal in the UK with the use of polonium and Novichok. And yet here is here is Nigel Farage acting on his behalf and being a political freaking leader and gaining more and more support, 15% plus support in the polls. This is so dangerous and so unacceptable. It is not cool. If you like Putin, if you like Farage, if you're a big fan of him and you're a big fan of reform, but you also understand what the hell is going on in Ukraine, you get on Twitter, you send an email straight to Farage and say, that is unacceptable. I'm with you, Nigel, on X, Y, and Z, but that is unacceptable. Because it is indeed so. John Healey, the Shadow Defence Secretary, called the comments disgraceful, adding that Farage has, quote, shown that he would rather lick Vladimir Putin's boot than stand up for the people of Ukraine. That makes him unfit for any political office in our country, let alone a serious party in Parliament. Earlier this week, Rishi Sunak said it was clearly ridiculous to blame the West for the war. Right, let's go on. So, in just a few, the BBC said, the BBC interviewed Ben Wallace, a former Defence Secretary, who did a really good job with Ukraine on the reaction to what Farage has said. He'll likely be asked to expand on his comments about Nigel Farage, who Wallace has described as Chamberlain, not a Churchill. In other words, Farage is just a two-bit appeaser. As he relied on a World War II analogy to suggest the Reform UK leader was appeasing Russian President Putin. You have here Ben Wallace. Let's return to that interview with Ben Wallace, a former Conservative Defence Secretary who is now speaking on BBC Radio 4's Today programme. Said, overnight the host points out the Reform UK leader expanded on his position, writing in a post on Twitter that he is, quote, one of the few figures that have been consistent and honest about the war with Russia. Right. So you've been consistent and honest. I would translate that you've been consistently wrong and an appeaser of Putin. Because you mix in those circles. You mix in the AfD circles and the Fidesz party circles. When you were in the European Parliament, when you actually, as fisheries minister or on the fisheries commission, when you actually turned up because you were getting paid by the EU, slagging off the EU and not turning up to meetings. Anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole. But you were mixing, and it appears you continue to mix in that entire pro-Russian ecosystem. Your consistent honesty, I would say, is consistent treachery. You don't pull the wool over my eyes, sunshine. So he says he's been consistent and honest about the war in Russia, and he added that Putin was wrong to invade a sovereign nation and the EU was wrong to expand eastward. He just can't come out, and he can't ever say something even remotely positive about the EU. So it's got to be about EU accession. What frustrates me is this person just hasn't spoken to Ukrainians, has not spoken to Ukrainians, has not seen the reality of the Euromaidan protests. As I always say, go and watch the Winter on Fire documentary on Netflix or now on YouTube. And you will find out that was a movement, a groundswell of desire from Ukrainians themselves. This wasn't EU expansionism. This was Ukrainian desire to move to the West, not EU desiring to move to the East. They're not going to say no if people from the East are saying we would like to be in the EU. You don't sit there and go, oh, do you? Oh, tough luck. No, they're going to welcome them in, especially given the significance of Ukraine for so many strategic reasons. But that's a groundswell of desire from Ukrainians. Just like after the Warsaw Pact fell apart, they went straight to NATO, those nations. It wasn't NATO scrabbling to get them. It was a voluntary movement saying we want to throw off the shackles of Soviet imperialism and move to the West. This is what Ukraine has done. And if you took the time to actually speak to Ukrainians, you would understand that, Farage. But no, you're a freaking pound shot Putin. Wallace maintains his argument from yesterday, saying Farage has been consistently wrong on the issue, and then goes on to say that Putin, quote, Putin isn't really invading Ukraine because of NATO expansionism. He cites an article penned by the Russian leader ahead of the invasion of Ukraine, which only mentions NATO in one paragraph of the 7,000-word essay that instead focused on ethnic nationalism. Boom! That was my point earlier. That was the issue back in 2014, and that continues to be the issue now, because that essay underwrites what Putin is trying to do. It's just a lie. What Farage is spouting is a lie. He should know better. If it's ignorance, he should damn well know better. He's got a platform and he should use it responsibly. Wallace then contextualizes his comments further by highlighting that only 6% of the Russian border has a NATO country on it, and that it is a defensive alliance, as it doesn't go around invading people like President Putin. Boom. Wallace, continuing with his critique of Farage, he was then asked, why are you so angry with him personally? And for Wallace, you can put Pierce in that. The former Defence Secretary goes on to describe the former UK leader as a bit like the pub bore we've all met at the end of the bar. The kind of person who often presents very simplistic answers to complex 21st century problems. He warns that he would be afraid of how Farage would deal with a figure like Putin if he were to become Prime Minister, adding that his comments about the Russian leaders being strong is an odd admiration of totalitarian leaders that we hear from parts of the Trump campaign. I don't want that anywhere in our politics. That's a conservative politician absolutely freaking nailing it. This is Trumpism that has its own mind virus has infected British politics. So you've got this weird mix of Putinism and Trumpism that manifests in Farage, who then spouts these pro-Russian lines. The Ukrainian government, on the other hand, has just told the BBC it will not comment officially on Farage's comments. However, a source in the presidential office told the BBC that, quote, and I love this because it's exactly what I've been saying, the virus of Putinism unfortunately infects people, and it can have consequences worse than COVID. This is my metaphor completely. This is what I absolutely love to think of it as. What else can you say? The virus of Putinism and the rise of war propaganda. The task of civilized humanity is to fight this virus in the bud, because in essence, this is fascism 2.0. Oh my goodness, spot on. Right, some other thoughts. Phillips O'Brien, who is something of an academic expert on the war in Ukraine. In the last 24 hours, both Donald Trump and Nigel Farage blamed NATO for the Ukraine war, speaking Russian propaganda lines exactly. If someone screams loudly and exactly what they are, you're best to believe them. So don't try and sit there and justify both Farage and Trump. Like, they are what they are, and accept it. Just own it. Hopefully, by owning it, you disabuse yourself of the notion that Trump or Farage are going to be good for the world. Certainly in this context. Nigel Farage, says Dr. Ian Garner, who is a scholar on Russian war propaganda. So he knows his Russian war propaganda. Nigel Farage claiming the West provoked Russia to invade Ukraine, once again proving himself anything but a patriot, a spineless little man whose love for dictators seems boundless. Christopher Steele says Nigel Farage's remarks to the BBC that NATO and the EU provoked the Ukraine war are disgraceful. Russia signed a 1994 Budapest memo guaranteeing Ukrainian territorial integrity, and NATO is purely a defensive alliance. Putin bears sole responsibility for the over 500,000 dead. Dr. Ian Garner then follows up with a full list of things that provoked Russia's war in Ukraine. Number 1, Russia. End of list. And Guy Verhofstadt, who is obviously Farage's arch nemesis in the EU. So he's very much a Remain campaigner, even though he's a Belgian. But he's a very pro-EU guy. I like Guy Verhofstadt myself. He says the mask slips. These are Kremlin talking points. In the European Parliament, Farage always defended Putin. You've got to remember this. You know who Farage is. Know what he has said in the past. This is not unexpected. It's just wholly unacceptable. Every vote for Farage is celebrated in Moscow, in the same way that every vote for Trump in the US is celebrated in Moscow. These two leaders are peas from the same pod.
Nigel Farage did an interview, a leaders' interview last night, where, well, he's upset a lot of people by saying the West provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What more did he say?
Yeah, I think this is significant, and I think, of course, he's previously said it, and he's previously talked of his admiration of Putin. He did actually try to dial it back because he said that he didn't like him as a person, but admired him as a political operator, given the control that he was able to exert Putin as is over Russia. Putin, of course, it runs a sort of, it's not quite a, it claims to be a democracy. There are elections, but
Ha!
it's a fairly authoritarian regime that he runs in Russia. And I think
It's a dictatorship. Say it as it is. It's a dictatorship, and Farage loves it.
there's a danger that Farage has overplayed his hand with this, isn't there? Because if you think back to the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, you think back to the widespread public support that we offered. 247,000 Ukrainians came to this country to seek refuge. And I think what's interesting is that both Labour and the Tories, having previously tried to ignore Farage, have actually gone on seen this as an opportune moment to attack Nigel Farage for what James Cleverly, the Home Secretary, described as his vile views when it comes to Putin's Russia. And I think there is also, if Nigel Farage is taking this stance, is he trying to appeal? It doesn't sit with trying to appeal to well-meaning Conservative voters or well-meaning Labour voters. It sits with trying to appeal to cranks who think that somehow Vladimir Putin is just misunderstood and was perfectly justified in what he did in Ukraine. We're talking about a country now that's been under bombardment. Ukraine, a sovereign country that's been under bombardment constantly from Russia now for more than 2 years. So I think Farage, rather than actually trying to undergo some sort of Damascene conversion where he admits that he was wrong and trying to broaden his appeal, has actually sort of narrowed it in, and I think that might end up potentially costing him.
And I would fully agree with that. He's doubled down, narrowed down, and he's gone let's go full Trump. Let's go full MAGA. Sorry, full MAGA. And I've been over, says Farage, over in the US. I've been in that ecosystem in the US for so long. I've been at these rallies. I've been shouting the same sort of stuff Trump shouts. I'm going to do that here, and we're going to distill reform down to a pure kind of British version of MAGA. And I'm sorry, I hope that UK population can see through that. I hope that we recognise him for what he is. And as I said previously a number of times, he's a pound shot Putin. Now, Talaria, who I had a video alive with regarding whether Russia are actually in the UN, has written a piece in her Substack, Knowledge is Power. NATO expansion, Putin's propaganda myth. So you've actually got an agreement in 1999, Charter for European Security, that was signed by Russia, Ukraine, and most other European states. Clause 8 says each participating state has an equal right to security. We reaffirm the inherent right of each and every participating state to be free to choose to change its security arrangements, including treaties of alliance, as they evolve. So it's signed by Russia that actually, if Ukraine wants to be in NATO, they can. Russia's agreement that Ukraine is not in its sphere of influence, and the last sentence, clause 8, explicitly states no state can consider any part of the OSCE area as its sphere of influence. You can't get much clearer than that. You've got this whole idea about NATO expanding eastwards and the kind of supposed Gorbachev agreements back in 1991 is just absolute codswallop. So in fact, NATO themselves have a really good page about debunking Russian disinformation on NATO. NATO is at war with Russia in Ukraine. That's a myth. NATO promised Russia it would not expand after the Cold War. That is a myth. Such an agreement was never made. The myth is that Gorbachev made an agreement that, hey, you can never go east of East Germany or whatever. Such an agreement was never made. NATO's door has been open to new members since it was founded in 1949. This has never changed. No treaty signed by NATO allies and Russia included provisions on NATO membership. Decisions on NATO membership are taken by consensus among its all allies. Russia does not have a veto. The idea of NATO enlargement beyond a united Germany was not on the agenda in 1989, particularly as the Warsaw Pact still existed until 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev himself said in an interview in 2014, quote, the topic of NATO expansion, because he was the one that was supposed to have agreed this, and he said the topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all, and it wasn't brought up in those years. I say this with full responsibility. Not a single Eastern European country raised the issue, not even after the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist in 1991. Western leaders didn't bring it up either. Individual allies cannot make agreements on NATO's behalf. President Clinton consistently refused Boris Yeltsin's offer to commit that no former Soviet republics would join NATO. Quote, I can't make commitments on behalf of NATO, and I'm not going to be in a position myself of vetoing NATO expansion with respect to any country, much less letting you or anyone else do so. NATO operates by consensus, he said. The wording NATO expansion is already part of the myth. NATO did not hunt for new members or want to expand eastward. NATO respects every nation's right to choose its own path. NATO membership is a decision for NATO allies and those countries who wish to join alone. These countries want to join NATO. But Putin will now call that NATO expansionism, which is this part of the mind virus that has infected people like, now we see Trump, now we see Farage saying it. Honestly, it is not acceptable that these people platform such egregious disinformational points. Anyway, go and check out Talaria's Knowledge is Power Substack and this particular article, because it's very, very detailed and does a good job of dispelling that myth. But I am not, you can tell, I'm not happy with Farage. I'm not happy that what I saw up until last night as a really united front in the UK for support for Ukraine, I see this as a challenge, and I see this as a Putin agent operating in the political corridors of power in the UK. And it is not cool. It is absolutely not cool. And Farage needs to be called out, and needs to be called out really robustly. And I'm here for it, because the man sucks. He's a pound shot Putin.